Hi, this is David Makinster. This is the first of two short lectures to supplement the reading in Weston's Practical Companion to Ethics. If you are taking another course from me, such as environmental ethics or moral issues or something of that kind, I may very well assign this video, but it was not created for that purpose, and so you may not be using the Weston book. You may be using Starhawk or Peter Singer or whatever. Nevertheless, these are some very standard issues and they have wide applicability. So we're going to begin by talking about deep hearing. Okay? Now, actually the Weston book is divided into three sections. Okay? The first section talks about why we do ethics and what ethics is, and the topic of deep hearing is important at that stage. The end part talks about applications, how we take our ethics out into the world. The middle part basically consists of tools that Weston has plundered from the fields of conflict resolution and mediation. And this is a move many philosophers have been advocating for decades. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We know what promotes constructive dialogue. We know it tends to thwart constructive dialogue. So why don't we simply use what people have discovered in other fields and incorporate that into our discussion of ethics or various other topics? Of course, while Weston is talking specifically about ethical dialogue or moral dialogue, what he has to say is applicable to any kind of dialogue, to any kind of discussion, any kind of coming together of different points of view with an attempt to find a way to live in the world together. So, wide applicability for the whole field of philosophy. Remarkable for a small book. One student in a past year found the book so inspirational she actually took digital photos of paragraphs from the book and posted them to her Facebook page. So there's a lot to be gained from the book if you read it in the proper way. Deep hearing. What is deep hearing? Well, many people would say deep hearing is at the core of the whole notion of dialogue. Deep hearing means that you are not simply responding to the surface of what's being said. And it's not simply the idea of reading between the lines. It's a matter of being very, very present in the dialogue, of really having what Confucius referred to as empathy and respect, the two fundamental things that, according to Confucius, were necessary in order for society to exist at all. One, empathy. You have to understand that other people are people, that they have feelings, they have aspirations, they have anxieties, they have exactly the same kinds of interior life that you do. Okay? And not only people, but groups of people, other living creatures, nature, we have to be able to have empathy, exchange self for other, say, you know, I need to be able to put myself into the place of the other. And having done that, to have respect. It matters that other people have feelings. It matters that animals are able to suffer. It matters that we can destroy the integrity of the environment. Okay? Empathy and respect. Empathy and respect arise out of deep hearing, actually being very, very present in the dialogue. I had a friend who was for many years a professor of religion at Smith College in Northampton. He was also a fully ordained Buddhist priest. Much of his writing was about deep hearing as it was represented in his tradition. So when this became sort of a trendy topic for therapists and educators about 10 years ago, he was often called on to do workshops and talk about deep hearing. I asked him once, Ty, when you talk about deep hearing, do you think that you're actually talking about the same thing that these various therapists who come to you for instruction are talking about? He just made a sort of a little face. Imagine a guy who looks for all the world like Mr. Miyagi and who acts all the world like Mr. Miyagi from Karate Kid. He just sort of made a thoughtful face, shook his head and said, you know, David, I've had probably a couple dozen students who have become therapists. I wouldn't send anybody to any of them. I said, why is that? And he said, because none of them actually practice deep hearing. For them, deep hearing is just another theory. It's just another stance to take. They listen until they can pigeonhole people, and then from that point on, they are only listening to themselves. I thought, well, you know, that in fact is very instructive, right? Not simply why you might say someone's not a particularly effective therapist, but do we do that in relationships? Do we do that when discussing politics, discussing religion? I'm only listening to you long enough to pigeonhole you, and then I'm only listening to myself after that point? Bill Clinton was once asked, what do you like least about yourself? And he said, once in a while I find myself not listening to people. I'm just waiting for them to be done so I can make my reply. And he said, when I catch myself doing that, I hate myself for it. That's not what I ought to be doing. I've known people who have had, been in on meetings between Bill Clinton and his advisors and so forth, and they've said the most remarkable thing about him was that he did really hear every bit of what everybody was saying on most occasions. So, I'm just giving these as examples, okay? When I pull in political examples, religious examples, whatever, I'm not proselytizing for any particular point of view. I'm just using them because they're good examples, okay? Well, if you are only listening long enough to pigeonhole someone, long enough to label them, you're not practicing deep hearing. Deep hearing means a few things. Mindfulness, you are actually very present. You're attentive. You have opened yourself up. If you've got this internal monologue going, all this judgment going on, you're not going to be able to hear what's being said to you. And if you can't hear what the other person is saying, how can you hope to communicate? There's a wonderful passage in Book 1 of Plato's Republic where a sophist named Thrasymachus has an absolute meltdown temper fit. He's calling people names, mocking their physical appearance, he's so angry with the way the conversation has gone. And Socrates, rather than replying in kind and getting angry in kind, he says, you know, Thrasymachus, I'm really very happy that you're saying what you're saying, because I think for the first time in this conversation, you're really telling us what you feel. You're telling us what you really think. Because, of course, that's what's important. Okay? Do we tend to be judgmental of others? Yeah, we do. We do. And part of that is just a sort of normal human tendency toward narcissism, right? And the other part is that it's been very trendy to think of truth, belief, whatever, as being a totally personal matter. I can guarantee if you were locked in the closet when you were 2 years old and let out when you were 30, you would not have discovered profound truths about the world and about other people. No, we find the truth by interacting with one another. The traditional view was that truth, reality, the world was part of the commons. It's part of what we shared. We have a common language. We can't have a common language unless we have common experiences. We can't have a common language unless there's something for that language to be about. We share the world. It's part of the commons. And that's how we are able to understand each other, how we are able to work together, how we are able to have relationships, able to have institutions. The degree to which we throw up a fence and say, nope, what's in here is private property. You can't come in without my permission. This is mine, which is the way the trend has been in modern thought. That makes it impossible to communicate. Taken to an extreme, we basically could not talk to each other at all because we would have no words to use, no common points of reference. The fact is, yeah, there are parts of our experience that are very private, but there are parts of our experience that we share by virtue of our humanity. Okay? Not simply with other people. The more we know about neurology, the more we know that, in fact, the difference between many different animals and human beings is a matter of degree, not a strict matter of kind. Here's the border, here's human, here's non-human. You take a look at, for instance, the neurology of a chimpanzee. The chimpanzee has the cognitive abilities of a small human child. Okay? Cows, pigs are smarter than dogs. Don't know if you knew that, but in fact pigs are much more intelligent than dogs. So what's the difference? Oh, we share a lot of things. You can communicate not only with other people, you can communicate with your dog, you can communicate with your cat. There are limits, but there are also infinite possibilities. Okay? For those possibilities to be explored, we have to be able to really be present for the other. Okay? I often talk to my stepson about how he handles he's very good with animals, but how he handles the cat, how he handles parakeets. Say you have to really be attentive to, sometimes the cat wants his space. He doesn't want to play. You have really good intentions about wanting to play with him, wanting him to be happy, wanting him to know he loves you. Sometimes he just wants you to leave him alone, and you have to be attentive to that. Okay? Okay, It's a matter of being present for the other, of deeply sensing the other, okay? Being mindful in your life. Remember we talked about Plato's chariot before in a previous video lecture. The chariot of the self is pulled by 3 horses: reason, appetite, and passion. You keep reason tethered out in front because it's the only one that can steer. It's the only one that can weigh consequences, consider alternatives, and keep you on the road rather than simply smashing the chariot to bits. Okay? Ethics ought to be simply an extension of that in matters of value. In matters of value. We need to have that steed of reason tethered out in front. Particularly because we can become very passionate about our values. We need to be thinking about what we're doing, what we're saying, and not just judging without thinking. Okay? It's a question of balance, just as that chariot analogy talked about before, a question of balance. It's not that you should have no feelings, you should have no appetites, you should have no desires, you should have no, care about nothing. Quite the opposite. If you care enough about your own life and about your relationship with others, then you need all the more to think about how can I best embody that caring, rather than simply lurching ahead, thinking that these 2 wild horses are going to take the chariot where it needs to go. Okay. The enemies, if you will, the antithesis of deep hearing are dogma, and what I like to say is the handmaiden of dogma, rationalizing. Dogma means that you've got a big emotional investment in a belief, but you don't have an equal rational investment. I really want this to be true, so much so that I'm not willing to consider that maybe it isn't. It's just too emotionally traumatizing for me, or I'm just too ego involved with this belief. Or I think that there is something sacred or wonderful or exultant about this belief. As Bertrand Russell said, we're going to be reading Russell later, as Bertrand Russell said, the fact that someone feels good on account of a belief or even behaves better because of a belief is no indication that that belief is actually true. And in the end, if we don't care about whether the belief is actually true, we're going to go off course. We're going to go off the tracks. Okay? Dogma means that you have already decided what the answer is before you've conducted the investigation. Okay? That makes dialogue impossible. In my ethics course, I start with a dialogue by Plato called the Euthyphro. Euthyphro can't make any progress on the issue they're discussing because Euthyphro's ego is steadfastly in the way. He has to believe that he already knows the answers. If, like Socrates, you're not willing to say, I don't know, let's figure it out, then guess what? You're going to be stuck in dogma. Now, dogma can go at least 2 directions. One is to really be invested in a belief that you haven't held up to scrutiny, that you don't have a good reason for believing. The other is to dogmatically be skeptical, to say, I will not believe no matter what evidence you give me. That is also a dogma. Disbelief, extreme skepticism can itself be a dogma. As the old aphorism puts it, there are 2 kinds of foolishness. One is to believe something you have no reason to believe, and the other is to refuse to believe something that you have every reason to believe. Okay? The goal is to have reasonable beliefs. To have reasonable beliefs, you have to say, you know what? There is a role for belief, there's a role for skepticism. If either is held primarily for emotional reasons and not held up to scrutiny, it becomes a dogma and it is a barrier to further investigation. It's a barrier to communication. It's a barrier to everything we need to do collectively, to do together. Rationalizing is, as I say, I like to call it the handmaiden of dogma. Rationalizing means that you are going through the motions of actually reasoning about your dogma. But in fact, you're cherry-picking your evidence. You're willing to accept things that, basically set the bar of evidence so low for the things you want to believe and raise it so unreasonably high for the things that you don't want to believe, that in fact all you're doing is prejudging the outcome of the investigation. It's not a real investigation. You're going through the motions. Rationalizing is not the same as reasoning. It's not the same as being rational, being reasonable. Rationalizing means you are simply creating the appearance without the reality of applying reason. Okay? People do that constantly. People do that particularly when they have an emotional investment in some political view, some religious view, some relationship issue or whatever. If I can filter my evidence, if I can fiddle with my standards of logic, I can guarantee that I'll get where I wanted to go at the beginning of the discussion. That is not dialogue. Okay? Diversity. Okay, we hear that term a lot. We used to hear the word tolerance a great deal. Now we hear the word diversity. For a long time, you would see bumper stickers that said, teach tolerance. Those have kind of gone by the wayside and been replaced with celebrate diversity. The reason for that is, although I think the intention of the two was probably the same, the reason for that was that people got sick and tired of the word tolerance. I've known many people. The first time someone verbally objected to this in one of my classes, it was a woman who identified herself as a lesbian, and she said, you know, I'm really sick and tired of the term tolerance. I'm not doing anything to anybody else. Where do they get off saying that they're being tolerant of me? If I were, barging into their living room or something, or if I were grabbing them by the collar and haranguing them, I'd be doing something to them. We're talking about my private life. It's none of their business. Who are they to say they're being tolerant? And, I've totally understood that, although I think the people saying teach tolerance meant essentially the same thing as the people who now say celebrate diversity. Tolerance makes it sound like you're putting up with something. Okay? Believe me, if you think you're putting up with something with people who are different from you, people who are different from you feel they're putting up with you. Okay? That's not a positive attitude. Celebrate diversity means, you know what, it's actually a good thing that we have different points of view. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German 19th century philosopher, once said, cultural incest, like biological incest, is likely to breed idiots. What do you mean by that? Well, if you have siblings having offspring, the genetic code of each is so much like one another that the defects, which would normally remain unexpressed, will combine and be expressed as birth defects. Okay? If you have offspring with someone whose genetic background is very different from your own, the likelihood of whatever flaws are in your genetic code, whatever flaws in the other's genetic code coming together and being expressed as a birth defect are far, 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 far less likely. Okay? Well, Nietzsche was using that as an analogy to what happens when your institutions, your beliefs, your values only feed upon themselves. You only talk with like-minded people. You only look at people like yourself. The flaws in your own beliefs, in your own approach to the world, will just combine and recombine with those who have similar beliefs and hence similar flaws until finally they become disastrous. When you have cross-cultural pollination, there are things we can learn from other cultures that we wouldn't necessarily have seen on our own. And there are things other cultures can learn from us that they would not necessarily have seen on their own. The idea that we can come together and celebrate our diversity, treat it as an asset rather than as a barrier or an obstacle or a problem, that's the idea that fuels real dialogue. Now, you may have been wondering why there's an elephant on the board here. Actually, there isn't. There's a picture of an elephant. There's a parable that comes from ancient India that I like to tell at this point. You may have heard it or you may have heard some form of it. There's a king in ancient India who has 7 blind wise men in his court. He keeps hearing stories about this marvelous creature called an elephant, but he's never seen an elephant. So he sends 6 of his 7 blind wise men out on a journey to discover what an elephant is. The 7th, the wisest of the wise men, he doesn't want to do without him for even a day, so he keeps that fellow at court. So eventually, the 6 blind wise men who are out on this journey encounter an elephant somewhere in the remote regions of the kingdom. One feels the trunk, one feels the tusk, one feels the ear, one feels the leg, one feels the side, and one pulls on the tail. Hurriedly, they journey back to the king, and the king says, "Did you find an elephant?" "Yes, sire, indeed we found an elephant." "Well, then tell me, what is this elephant?" The one who felt the trunk said, "Sire, the elephant is a great serpent." And the one who felt the tusk said, "No, the elephant is like a great saber." The one who felt the leg said, no, the elephant is a mighty tree trunk. The one who felt the ear said, no, the elephant's like a great palm leaf. The one who felt the side said, no, the elephant is a craggy cliff. The one who pulled on the tail said, sire, they are all wrong. The elephant is a rope leading up to heaven. And the king said, how do you know it leads to heaven? Because, sire, when you pull on the rope, the heavens open. Don't think too much about that. Okay, so the king turns to the seventh blind wise man and says, what do you make of all this? The seventh blind wise man says, sire, I believe they are all speaking true insofar as they are all saying what they experienced. But they are all speaking a deep falsehood when they assume that their experience is all there is to the matter. If you can find a way for them to combine their experiences, then you may have a better idea of what the elephant was actually like. Okay? That's the end of our discussion on deep hearing.